Hi, AP Environmental. It's me here, Mrs. Willis, and I am here to talk to you about a very important topic in Unit 5, and that is all on irrigation or how we water our crops. So let's go ahead and get started talking about all the different kinds that exist here in our agricultural world. The first thing that you need to know is that irrigation does use a lot of our fresh water. If you take a look at these charts here, these nice little pie diagrams, you'll see that irrigation uses about 40% of our fresh water. It's not the number one use, that goes to power sources and energy, but it is still a pretty big use of our water. And you might think, well, yeah, that's kind of obvious, right? Because irrigation, it waters our food and we need food in order to survive. So it is a huge number, but there's a reason for it, right? In case you don't know what irrigation is, it's pretty much the process of taking water and putting it on our lands or our agricultural crops to help promote the growth of plants. Like all organisms, plants are composed of cells, and those cells require water in order to live. So if we want our plants to grow nice and big, we need to put water on the fields to ensure that they're getting enough water for this plant growth. Like I just said, water is needed for plant growth. So obviously that's why it's so important. We do need these plants in order to live off of so we can eat them or we feed them to our animals and then we eat those animals. But obviously it's important for plant growth. What some people may not know is that irrigating your crops is actually really important in rinsing away salts that may have accumulated in the soils. Now, salts are very common in the soil, okay? And they tend to build up in the soil. Well, if you don't wash them away with irrigation, those salts do build up and it leads to decreased germination rates of those plants. So farmers really need to maintain their salt levels on the soils, and one way they do that is by washing away the salts that could harm the crops. And they do that with the use of irrigation. One problem that can happen if you put too much water on your fields is a process called waterlogging. And waterlogging occurs when you irrigate your land too much. So that water tends to pool on the soil, and you might be asking, well, why is that a bad thing? Plants need water. Well, it kind of messes with the plant roots and their ability to take up oxygen. So if they're not able to take up oxygen or any of the nutrients that they may need, then they're not going to grow effectively. Now, there are four kinds of irrigation that the College Board says you need to know. So there's drip irrigation, flood irrigation, furrow irrigation, and spray irrigation. And we're going to go through each of those right now. The first type of irrigation is called furrow irrigation. And in this technique, what farmers do is they cut big pieces of land that are called furrows. So they kind of dig these channels in between their crop rows, and then they fill those furrows with water. This is a relatively inexpensive technique because all you have to do is really dig channels next to your crops and flood them with water. However, this isn't so efficient. About 33% of the water that's put in those furrows pretty much sits, and it's subjected to evaporation and runoff. So you do lose a lot of your water through evaporation and runoff because the water is just sitting in those furrows. The second one I think you're probably most familiar with is called flood irrigation. And like the title says, you take water and you flood your field. And crops like rice really do need to grow in these flooded environments. But kind of like furrow irrigation, you're letting big pools of water just sit out in the open. So they are also subjected to evaporation and runoff. And about 20% of that water is lost due to those processes. It can also lead to waterlogging of the soil because you are putting mass amounts of water on the soil and it's just sitting there. The third type of irrigation is called spray irrigation. You may be familiar with this if you have lawns in your backyards with a sprinkler system. So what you do in a spray irrigation system is you take water and you put it through a system with nozzles, and then it sprays your field or backyard, whatever you're using it for. This is somewhat efficient, but you notice there is still water loss here due to evaporation and runoff because you're spraying water out into the air. Of course, some of it can evaporate, or once it reaches the ground, runs off into the nearest waterway. It is a little bit more expensive than flood or furrow irrigation because you need these tools and techniques in order to spray your field. So you do need equipment, and it also requires energy to run. So you have to have some sort of energy source to be able to push or move these spray nozzles to their intended location. The last irrigation technique is called drip irrigation. This is the one that's most efficient because in drip irrigation, what you do is you take tubes and you perforate the tubes. So you put holes in these tubes and then you move the tubes so that the water that comes through that little hole directly arrives at the plant roots or near the plant roots. So you can see here in these pictures, these little tubes are moving around or near the plants to deliver the water directly towards the plant. So with this type of system, it is about 95% efficient. 5% is lost due to evaporation or runoff, which is way better than the other three. However, look at that. System is really expensive to maintain, and because it's expensive, it's not often used. All of the irrigation techniques we just mentioned use water. And so one of the things that can happen is we are using too much of our water. Now, where is this water coming from? Well, it really depends upon your geographic location here in the United States. So if you are here in Los Angeles, like we are pulling our water from the Sierra Nevada mountain range. We're pulling it from the Colorado River, and some of it is in the ground, but not very much. However, if you are in the Midwest and you're a farmer in those agricultural fields, you are probably pulling your water from the largest aquifer that's in the United States called the Ogallala aquifer, or it's also known as the High Plains aquifer. This big aquifer is slowly being depleted. People are taking water from it for irrigation purposes for our food. There's been a lot of studies right now looking at how much water is left in this aquifer, but we really have to make sure that we take care and not overuse our groundwater for irrigation purposes.